Hello and welcome to the Action Network podcast, the UFC betting preview for UFC 311. I'm Sean Zerillo, joined today by Billy Ward to help you break down this 14-fight card for UFC 311 going live on Saturday. Prelims at 6 p.m., main card 10 Eastern from the Intuit Dome in Inglewood, California. Most importantly, the Russians on this card is Makhachev, Umar Nurmagomedov, not getting the typical body clock that they've gotten in their best performances, taking place overseas in Abu Dhabi. Also not going to get the local judging, and judging will probably lean more towards damage as opposed to grappling on this card. So some things to keep in mind as we talk about these number of fighters from the Middle East who typically get deference in terms of the grappling and also get their typical body clock and less travel fighting on those cards. They are coming to the United States for this one and going to have to make some small adjustments physically to get into their fights, make weight, etc. Main event, couple title fights on this card, but the main event, a lightweight title matchup and a rematch between Arman Tsarukyan and Islam Makhachev. This is a rematch from 2019. Tsarukyan made his UFC debut against Makhachev, was lined about the same price, plus 275, currently plus 275 on the line. Now, Islam won that fight 30-27 on two of the cards, 29-28 on the third. He did get better as the fight went on. Seemed like he was taking over in the third round, but Tsarukyan did come into that fight on short notice. And now, 6 years later, it's Tsarukyan who's more in his physical prime in terms of the age. There's a 5-year age gap between these two. I did mention Islam's best performances coming over in Abu Dhabi. His last fight against Dustin Poirier in New Jersey, I thought he looked not a shell of him former self, but a reduced version of the Islam Makhachev we had seen previously. Didn't get Dustin out of there until the 5th round. Strength seemed to be reduced. Endurance seemed to be reduced. That said, he apparently was also dealing with an injury going into the fight. So perhaps that was what caused the reduction in performance, the reduction in explosiveness relative to what we had seen previously. But there was no doubt that was a lesser version of Islam Makhachev than we saw in his prior fights against Alexander Volkanovski and Charles Oliveira. I do think Arman is the better athlete of the two. I think he's more so in his physical prime. He has a 2-inch reach advantage. I think he may be the better striker. At worst, the striking is extremely competitive. I think both of these guys have improved their striking drastically since the first fight. Islam is the better wrestler, and Arman is probably not going to be able to mix in offensive takedowns here to rest or get top time. So, 5-round fight, line to go to a decision, expect it to be close and competitive for at least the first 3 rounds. We'll see how the cardio dynamic plays out in the later rounds with Islam being older, with Arman finally getting some 5-round experience under his belt. I do think this is a potential value trap where Arman basically covers the line, right? Makes it look closer than the plus 275 indicates, but Makhachev wins the fight 3-2. But I do think it's dog or pass on the money line. I'm interested in the fight to end inside the distance, but I actually prefer Arman's side of the finish props. His knockout prop at plus 800, I think is super live if he wins this fight, just because I do think it leads back to Islam being a slightly slowed down and reduced version of what we've seen previously. So taking Arman as the value side of the money line at plus 280. This line, though, did previously touch plus 300. I'm going to wait to see probably if it gets there again. Maybe I'll fire half a bet at plus 275, and I'll look to add more on fight day at plus 300. Billy, did you already jump in on this line? Are you joining me on Tsarukyan? I believe you are at about plus 280. I think you might have gotten them earlier in the week at plus 300, plus 330. So where is your cutoff point on betting Tsarukyan? And do you already have a wager?
Yeah, it's tough. Like, as you alluded to, I put it out in my luck ratings. I got plus 330 on Tsarukyan earlier in the week. I only did a quarter unit, and I'll explain why in a second. But if we see plus 300, I'd, fist pump in another 3/4 of unit. Plus 280, I'd still take. I think you're really sharp with saying it's a value trap and that, a close loss for Tsarukyan is probably the likeliest outcome here. I think both of the favorites in the title fights here, their biggest advantage is cardio. We've only seen Tsarukyan go 5 rounds one time. He kind of faded down the stretch with Gamrot. Similar fight stylistically with Makhachev, where it's a guy he can't dominate with the grappling. Striking is close. I think Makhachev probably has the technical edge, where Tsarukyan's a little bit more powerful, more explosive. I think Tsarukyan, his actual straight up wrestling, if we threw these guys in singlets, might be better than Makhachev. But in terms of his submission skills and MMA grappling, that's probably the clearer edge for Makhachev. of the pair. Not that I see either of them getting a submission unless someone's real tired or real beat up. I was really hoping we'd get the plus 9.5 lines we'd been seeing the last few weeks on the 5-round title fight. DraftKings caught on that we were all hammering those, and they dropped it back down to plus 5.5 for Tsarukyan. Don't love that. It's really hard to cover that in a 5-round fight. You need to clearly win 2 rounds, and at that point, I'd rather just bet on him to clearly win one more round at close to plus 300. So that's why I held off and made it a smaller bet, because I was going to come back in with Arman on that point spread. Not an option. I don't hate, especially if you got the better price on Arman earlier in the week, then taking Makhachev minus 5.5 at minus 140. Usually with those, we want to be on the side of the favorite when we get a much better price, because, again, it's not that hard to cover the 5.5 across the course of 5 rounds. Other thought, I wouldn't hate Makhachev live if this gets closer to even. I think most of the success for Tsarukyan is going to be early. He is the better athlete. He is more explosive. That all comes with a cardio cost, where Makhachev looked pretty much like the same guy in the 5th round against Poirier as he did in the 1st round. And we've seen Tsarukyan, even in 3 rounds against Charles Oliveira, kind of hanging on for dear life in the last minute of that fight. He's in great shape, but no matter how good a shape you're in, if you're exploding that hard, working that hard for takedowns, he explodes from the outside and scrambles to get takedowns. Makhachev likes a lot of cheeky little trips and drags that don't take nearly as much energy. So if we get the price on Makhachev, I'll probably kind of hedge out with that. Not sure that we necessarily do, but keep that in mind as you're watching this one.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the point spreads, the 5.5s. I mean, there's really no upside to betting the underdog plus 5.5 points. You're hoping to get 49 46s, times 1, and then 48 47 times 2. That doesn't even do it for you. You'd lose by, I guess that's the only way it works, right? 48 47 times 2, and then 49 46 times 1. That's the only way you're covering like the actual 5.5. Otherwise, you need 48 47s across the board. If there's 2 49 46s in there, you lose that bet. So yeah, the 9.5, much easier to cover than the 5.5. And then we're going to turn our attention to another fight with that 5.5 line. Merab Dvalishvili, plus 240, current bantamweight champion, against Umar Nurmagomedov, minus 270. This fight also juiced heavily to go to a decision at minus 225. That's about 70% implied, yet Merab coming in as a big underdog when he's been one of the best minute winners in the history of the sport. Now, Umar is not necessarily a good matchup for him because, unlike a lot of the guys Merab has fought, Umar can wrestle, and Umar is potentially the better striker here as well. Would say the better technical striker. I give Merab the volume edge, the output edge, and it is really hard to make Merab a big underdog against anybody just because of the output and the pace that he keeps. That said, I would think we both agree that Umar probably has more finishing upside in this fight. We've seen Merab hurt in a number of spots, nearly get put away in a number of fights. Did get controversially choked out to end one of his bouts, but nearly finished by Marlon Moraes. He's been hurt in other of his fights as well, and I would be surprised, frankly, if Umar doesn't hurt him at some point in the first couple of rounds here, just with Merab's aggressive style, the way he leaves his shin up in the air. I think it's very likely he gets clipped, dropped at some point in the first couple of rounds, and then maybe you get an even better price on Merab live than you did pre-fight. Now, I'm not going to be counting entirely on that. I will allocate something to Merab pre-fight in the event that this does just play out as a close and competitive kickboxing match over the course of 25 minutes, because I think that wrestling for both fighters could end up neutralizing one another and lead to this playing into more of a kickboxing match. Going back to the main event too, I think there's a chance. It was very wrestly and scrambly in their first fight. I think there's a chance it just plays out as more of a distance kickboxing match this time around. So 2 matchups between a pair of wrestlers, main event, co-main event. I think we end up seeing potentially 2 more striking-oriented fights that are aligned to go to a decision. And in both cases, if they are going to go all 25 minutes, it does lend itself to betting the underdogs as the value sides. Now, Billy, as I said, Umar more finishing upside. That's the way you're going pre-fight. Umar inside the distance, hoping he gets it done early. And then, as I said, you're also banking on the fact that if he doesn't finish the fight in the first couple of rounds, you likely get a better price on Merab live, potentially after round 1 or round 2.
Yeah, I actually really wanted to be on Merab pre-fight here. Like, I was trying to find a way to justify it, but he doesn't really have a clear skill advantage anywhere, right? Like, Umar's never been taken down in the UFC. He's a Khabib protege. if your plan is to beat those guys on grappling, it's usually not a very good plan. And that's the case here for Merab. But the one advantage he does have is cardio and pace. Typically, we've only seen Umar go 5 rounds once. You know, who was it? Cody Sandhagen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Corey, sorry. You know, not a bad opponent, but like not a guy who's really going to push him in the wrestling and stuff like that. I would list Umar's cardio right now as question mark. You know, like it's probably not a weakness of any sense, but I don't think he's going to be Merab. The other problem I have is just like kind of the vibes are off from Merab. He didn't really want to take this fight now. He wanted more time off. We saw that with Aljamain Sterling losing to a guy badly when he kind of got rushed back into it. I think we talked about it last time we were on here, but like the UFC just kind of hates these Sarah Longo type guys for whatever reason. They just don't, probably because they didn't want to fight each other, and that started the whole thing. So I'm not feeling too good about Merab's chances overall, unless Umar works really hard and the striking gets tired after 2 or 3 rounds, and then Merab starts taking him down. So I like Umar at plus 300 inside the distance. I also kind of like his point spread of minus 5.5. It's minus 115, hoping for a slightly better price, but there's a lot of scenarios where he wins all 3 of the first rounds and lands one big shot in the 4th or 5th or whatever and covers without a finish. It's just too big of a price gap from his finish line for me. So I'll have about half a unit on the plus 300. And then, like you said, if we get Merab at plus 500, plus 600, that's when it's Merab's time, right? Like he's going to drop the early rounds more often than not against a guy who can defend takedowns, come back against him. But yeah, I'm just kind of worried about Merab overall. He's 34, didn't want to fight now, has taken some damage. Feels very Aljamain Sterling-esque with the way this is being set up.
Coming in with a cut on his leg as well. He had stitches a couple of weeks ago. Leg still looks pretty damaged. Some people have said it's staph infection. It's clearly like an injury that he had stitched up that is still bruised up and red and puffy. Doesn't look great though. And I don't know if, a couple of kicks from him, a couple of kicks from Umar, scraping it against the cage, scraping it against the canvas. I don't know if that's going to open that thing up. And blood optics certainly favor the fighter who's not bleeding, regardless of how that blood happened. If it's a close round otherwise and one guy's bleeding, the guy who's not bleeding is going to get the round scored in his favor. So just another, point potentially in Umar's corner. I would not lay the juice on Umar's money line, to be clear, though. I think Billy played it correctly, either Umar inside the distance at plus 300 or his point spread, the minus 5.5 at minus 110. That seems like a better way to play into the upside of him potentially dominating the minutes in this fight, winning clear minutes in this fight, getting back control, holding it for extended stretches against the guy whose teammate is one of the best back takers in the sport. So I'm not sure how long Merab is going to spend getting back here. And if he doesn't spend too much time in back control, I do think, as I said, we see more of a competitive striking fight for 25 minutes where Merab may have the volume edge over the final 2 rounds. Merab pre-fight small, plus 240. Prefer him live. This was another line, too, that was closer to plus 300 and came tumbling down. So may get back up there on fight day. Don't want to allocate too much at the current moment to Merab's reduced money line when we may get a better number on Saturday. Let's turn our attention to our favorite underdogs. A number of underdogs cashed last week. Shouted a few of them out on this podcast. Number of underdogs I like this week as well. Billy, we're in agreement on 2. I'll have 2 more that I'll shout out beyond that. The 2 we're in agreement upon. First fight of the night, Clayton Carpenter, plus 265 against Tagir Ulanbekov. Ulanbekov is a 33-year-old flyweight on the wrong side of the age curve for the division. He's had a number of split and close decision wins throughout his career. He's also pulled out a ton in the UFC. He's pulled out of 8 fights. He's more than he's actually fought. It's the guy who has trouble making the weight. He's missed weight before. He doesn't have good cardio in the 3rd round. He is the bigger fighter here. He has a 4-inch reach advantage over Carpenter, but he's 5 years older, and I think Tagir has gotten to the point where he is on the downslope of his career at flyweight. Carpenter, a very dangerous fighter, undefeated in his career, taking him at plus 265. Billy, you're joining me on that one, right?
Yeah, 100%. The big thing is that Clayton Carpenter is also a very good grappler, because you don't want to back pure strikers against these Team Habib guys. Like, we kind of have seen how that one plays out over and over again. Carpenter, very high-level jiu-jitsu guy, good wrestling. Both of his UFC wins are submissions. He got 3 takedowns in his Contender Series fight without a submission. So that kind of base plus the youth and athleticism, I think, is enough given the price we're getting. This one's kind of been all over the place, the line. I think it's been both higher and lower at different points, but really anything past plus 200 or so I'd still be comfortable with. Although, obviously, go out and get the best lines if you can.
Carpenter trains at the MMA lab. Number of good fighters there. He's not the same size as Sean O'Malley and the other bantamweights in that room. He's a bit smaller. I wonder if he does train with those guys, though, which would stand to level him up if he's a flyweight training with a bunch of UFC level bantamweights. But good gym. Trust that they'll have him ready for this fight. Another underdog we're in agreement on, Beneil Dariush at plus 140 against Renato Moicano. Money Moicano. Dariush was closer to plus 200 earlier in the week. This one has really come down as well. These guys are surprisingly the same age. I think they're both 35 years old. Dariush is just much older in terms of fight years, in terms of recent damage, knockout losses in his last two fights against Charles Oliveira and Arman Tsarukyan. But skill for skill, I think Dariush is the better wrestler in this fight. I think his grappling is amongst his best skills and can match up with Moicano. I think Moicano the better submission grappler overall, but I think Dariush is good enough to get on top and stay safe on top. And then the striking, I think Moicano has gotten better in the past couple of years. I think his boxing has gotten a little sharper, but both of these guys are chinny. I don't think either of them have particularly good cardio. I think this is basically a 50-50 fight, aside from the fact that Benny has just been knocked out brutally, but against high level opponents. You look at Moicano's recent fights, nearly knocked out by Jalen Turner. If Turner hadn't tried to walk away and walk that off, he might have been given credit for the knockout. Losing on the scorecards in other fights, coming back as a live underdog. He did dominate Benoit Saint-Denis in the first round, but then the way that fight was seeming to go, aside from BSD having like the damage on his face, he was still very much competitive within the movements of that fight, within the scrambles of that fight. So it's not like Moicano, aside from the damage, was, one-way traffic and pulling away completely. If you take the cutaway from Benoit Saint-Denis at that point, I think he may win the fourth and fifth rounds. So taking Beneil Dariush, plus 140 by decision as well, interests me at plus 400. Billy, any props for you on this fight? And I know you like Beneil as well.
No, I don't think so. I think I'm actually slightly more confident in Dariush than you are. He doesn't really have more fight miles on him. He's just had gray hair since he was like 19, so he looks like he's 70 years old. Like, go look up a picture of Beneil Dariush if you don't recognize him. He's looked like that since he was like seriously his early 20s. Had we not seen him badly knocked out in his last two fights, I think he'd be a rightful like minus 150, if not more, favorite. Moicano wins with his grappling. I think he intentionally let off the gas against BSD, knowing that the eye was just going to be enough of an issue that it was going to get stopped either way, and he didn't want to take any chances. I don't know if that's true or not. It's hard to say for sure. But yeah, Dariush, for those who don't know, was like a grappling prodigy. He showed up at a gym in Chicago at 18, no wrestling, no childhood experience, and then was like qualifying for ADCC within 3-ish years. Just a really, really good grappler. At worst, can cancel out the grappling of Moicano, but if we put these guys in a jiu-jitsu match, I'd bet on Dariush every time. So, and then we get to the striking. As you pointed out, both guys kind of chinny. Moicano has one knockdown in his UFC career, and it was at featherweight. So not a guy I really expect to challenge Dariush's chin. Plus, Dariush has had more than a year off since those fights. You like to think hopefully that helps the chin a little bit. I don't know how much of a difference it'll make, but it can't hurt. So, yeah, a couple of chinny guys. One guy I think is the better grappler. That guy is also bigger and stronger and has just as much power on the feet, if not the technical striking. So I would play Dariush at anything plus money. I'm not trying to get cute here. You could take a finish. I get the logic, but I'd rather just bet his money line and let it ride.
Yeah, I think Dariush technically the biggest money line edge that I projected on this card. I make him a small favorite. And again, he was plus 190 earlier in the week. This line has just really come crashing down. I think I'm a little bit, not sad, but, just disappointed I didn't get the peak number on this fight. And that's like partially my hesitancy jumping in fully at plus 140 as opposed to the near 2-1 you got earlier in the week. But yeah, glad you mentioned, if the Dariush knockouts hadn't happened, and obviously they did happen, and you have to factor that into the line. But what fight is most stylistically similar to this for Moicano? I think it's the Rafael dos Anjos fight. And RDA absolutely dominated Moicano on the mat for the first 4 rounds. RDA was a minus 200, minus 175 favorite going into that fight. I think that's probably what the line would be if you hadn't seen those recent knockouts against Dariush. And again, more of a year off to recover his brain following those losses. So go ahead, Billy.
And for Dariush, probably the closest comp stylistic was when he fought Mateusz Gamrot, who he dropped and largely didn't struggle with the grappling at all. So like you can play that game from both sides, and they both kind of come out looking pretty favorable for Dariush.
And Gamrot, a significantly better wrestler than Moicano. Doesn't have as good of jiu-jitsu, but yeah, I think that's where Dariush wins the fight, is with the wrestling. I think that's the biggest skill advantage that either has over the other in this matchup. Couple more underdogs I'm going to give out here. Billy Elikana at plus 280 against Bogdan Guskov. Guskov was a dog in all three of his UFC fights today. Plus 154, plus 120, plus 165. This guy cannot grapple. I think I've been on the wrong side in all three of his fights so far. So hopefully not on the wrong side here for the fourth time. But he was knocked down and choked out in his debut. He was losing on the scorecards to Zach Pauga before knocking him out. And Ryan Spann gassed after winning the first round, which is what Ryan Spann typically does. Now, Elikana is on short notice, but this guy's pretty well-rounded, and I think he's clearly the better grappler in the fight. I think he can compete in the striking. But, full grappling upside, plus 280. I don't think Guskov is anything more than, just live to a knockout in every single one of his fights, but that makes him, like, at best, probably 60% in any matchup over anybody who can competently strike. And considering Elikana has the grappling upside, I think plus 280 is a very wide number. And then lastly, Diego Ferreira at plus 210, also by knockout at plus 700, or inside the distance at plus 450 against Grant Dawson. I do think if Ferreira wins, it is likely inside the distance. Dawson is a very good grappler, but he's more of a one-dimensional backtake specialist. He's the much younger fighter here, 9 years younger. I think if this fight extends to a second or third round, Dawson should have a severe cardio advantage. And for that reason, I think Dawson plus 750 round 2, 10-1 round 3, both absolutely worthy pokes. You can also consider him live after round 1. But Ferreira pre-fight, inside the distance, plus 450, maybe a tenth of a unit poke. And then you can also try to hit Dawson round 2 and round 3. This might be a rare fight where I'll try to end up on both sides of it. But if Ferreira cannot get grappled here, if he can defensively grapple, resist, he should be the much better and more dangerous striker. And I think he has a chance to put Dawson away early. If the fight extends, Dawson starts getting the takedowns, I think Ferreira tires out and potentially loses by ground and pound in round 3. Billy, any thoughts on either of those fights, Elikana versus Guskov, Dawson versus Ferreira, before we move on to our top props?
Yeah, I can't quite get there on Elikana. I'm definitely not betting Guskov, but I think just the physical tools are going to be tough on short notice because Elikana did a lot of his career at middleweight. So can he just get overpowered by a bigger guy who had a full camp? I wish we could have seen Bogdan versus Johnny Walker because that would have been a hilarious fight. One way or the other, like something stupid was going to happen. I don't know for who or how, but I've also mostly been on the CDF side. I haven't bet it yet myself. Do you know what Saturday is, Sean, besides UFC 311?
I do not.
It is Carlos Diego Fajeda's 40th birthday. You cannot lose on your birthday, obviously. Last time he fought on his birthday, he got a performance of the night submission win over Anthony Pettis. Obviously, none of that matters, actually, but I just thought that was a fun fact that he's actually turning 40. Like, he's celebrating his 40th birthday by getting in a cage fight. So, shout out to CDF. I actually really like your late sprinkles or knockout sprinkles. He probably does lose a decision the vast majority of the time with Dawson's grappling. But he looked good against another kind of up-and-coming grappler in Mateusz Rebecki last time. One of those guys who just doesn't seem to be aging somehow. But, if you magically age at age 40, that's a problem. So, a little bit worried there. But, yeah, I'll have some kind of CDF exposure. I'm just not quite sure exactly how I want to approach it.
Yeah, somehow not aging. Mystery that these guys from Brazil seem to be fighting well into their late 30s and early 40s. Worth mentioning, too, we talked about Makhachev, Tagirolo, and Bekov earlier. These guys are 33, but, these fighters, these Dagestani fighters who have been training since they were children and, take absolutely no time off other than their time between fights, these guys do seem to age a little bit quicker, than other fighters. I feel like they've been putting a toll on their bodies since they were literally children and taking almost no time off. And I do feel like they're kind of older than their 33-year-old age would indicate. And that just goes back to the athleticism advantage I feel that a guy like Clayton Carpenter or Arman Tsarukyan could potentially have over their older opponents. It says 33 on paper. We usually draw the line at 35 in title fights because No fighter below 170 pounds has ever won a title fight at age 35 or older. 33 years old, 34 years old for Merab. You know, I think you can kind of draw the line maybe a little bit shorter, 33, 34. Yes, you're not quite 35. That's not the actual cutoff that we have. But these guys have taken a lot of damage. Merab, you know, the pace Merab fights at, can he keep that up into his mid-30s, you know, late 30s? Merab maybe on some supplements as well. So I think Merab can, but these Dagestanis, I'm not so sure the athleticism is sticking around. And, you know, if they got on the same supplements as Diego Ferreira, I don't know if they would ever lose.
There's also a definite non-zero chance that they literally are older than their ages are listed on Tapology or anywhere else. Like we see it in baseball all the time. I forget who it was who came over, a Brazilian fighter that they found out was actually like 3 years older than he claimed to be. We know the UFC likes young guys and stuff like that. Like, it would not shock me if we found out down the line that Khabib is like 4 or 5 years older than we've thought he was this entire time. Like, seriously. So I agree with your points. Like, I've had some high-level wrestlers I know who are like, I'm not putting my kids in wrestling until middle or high school just because I don't want their bodies broken down too early. And then again, maybe like the record keeping in Dagestan in the late 80s, early 90s was probably not the most reliable.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. There was a Russian fighter who claimed he was like 35. He was in the UFC a few years ago. He would lose in the first round every time. He had 2 bad knees. But his picture, he legitimately looked like he was 55 years old. And I was like, I would post about him. I was like, there's no way this guy's 35. Absolutely not a chance in the world. He looked 55. At best, he was probably 40 or 45. I mean, the UFC is letting guys before who have fraudulent records. You know, they are able to slip in fake wins and losses from promotions that should be documented. If guys are lying about their age and getting into the promotion, I wouldn't be particularly shocked either. So, it wouldn't be surprising to find out down the line that we had some age verification issues with some
I think
of these
it might
fighters.
be Aldo that got caught. Like, I think Jose Aldo's age jumped at one point. Like, it might have even been the other way, where he was lying to be older to be allowed to take pro fights. But there was something tricky with him. I was trying to Google it while you were talking, but yeah, there's definitely some shenanigans there. It's not like this is all that well reported.
Let's talk about a couple more fights on the main card. Jamal Hill against Yuri Prochazka, and then Kevin Holland against Rainier de Ritter. I like the under in both of these fights, under 2.5 rounds as my quote-unquote top props. I also like Hill inside the distance at plus 165. And then I think you could choose between Holland inside the distance or de Ritter by submission as your potential bets in the other fight as well at plus money. So we'll start with the Hill fight because I know you've got thoughts there as well, Billy. Hill was even money earlier in the week. Now he's blown out to about minus 140. He is the better boxer in this matchup. He is the better defensive striker. Now, that's not saying much. Both of these guys are terrible defensively. Hill defends strikes at 46%. Prochazka defends strikes at 39%. I mean, these guys are both punching bags. Now, Yuri's talked about having his hands up more for this fight. Finally being in a better defensive position. He looked awful against Poatan. I mean, he just looked scared to be in there, but he was just absorbing everything and not throwing anything back either. I think he landed 5 strikes in the entire fight in the rematch. Jamal Hill has the leg injury stuff coming into the fight still. You know, he came back prematurely from an Achilles injury, which coming back early from that type of injury is very easy to re-injure it. He also had knee surgery as well, but I think he's the better boxer here. I think Yuri's the better kicker. I think Jamal is the better wrestler. I think Yuri is the better grappler. So they each have advantages. I think it makes it close to a 50-50 fight, except I would give a durability edge to Jamal, like just a pure head punch durability edge. And I would give him the wrestling upside. And I think if somebody's going to land a takedown and hold top position for a minute or two and win a round, I think it's Jamal. So I understand the move from Jamal evens to Jamal minus 140. I think I made Jamal minus 150, though. I wouldn't bet it past where it is currently. Maybe minus 135 would be my cutoff. Billy, I'm sure you probably agree with that assessment on the line. I do, though, like Jamal inside the distance at plus 165, and then the under 2.5 rounds at minus 170, considering Yuri's chin issues. He gets hurt in every fight. But also the leg stuff with Jamal and the fact that he just may re-injure that Achilles. You know, it may be not 100% from where it was previously, and he could just go down via injury. On top of the fact that this could just be a high variance fight that Yuri, steps into the pocket and forces a finish either way, because that is something he tends to do. He did it with Rakic, ended up coming out on top of that after trailing the fight. So, Billy, I would assume you would pass at Hill's money line at current prices, maybe interested in his inside the distance prop. And then how do you feel about the total in this fight?
Yeah, I think that about sums it up, where we missed the good line. I have this down as one of my best bets, but I'm kind of taking credit for the line I got in luck ratings. Usually with those, I bet half a unit earlier in the week and see if anything changes. This one, I just immediately bet to win the full unit on Hill. Stylistically, it's kind of a nightmare for Yuri because he swings wild. Hill's defensive numbers, I think, are a little bit unfair to what he's trying to do, because he'll step in and deflect and stuff like that in order to land counter strikes, right? Like, he puts himself at risk. Where Yuri just gets punched for the fun of it, I guess. I don't know, because he likes getting punched. I don't know what Yuri's deal is. Not a lot of interest in defense. Even if he plans on putting his hands up for the first time in his career, this is a dude well into his 30s, been fighting a long time. You're not going to change those habits that fast. And then the other thing, I always like betting on guys, their second fight back from an injury, because it was certainly premature for Hill against Pereira. We can say maybe he got a little unlucky with the weird stoppage where, Pereira waved Herb Dean off and then got outside foot position on the restart, which I'm not saying it's lucky. I think Pereira was going to finish him one way or the other. But, you can give Hill a little bit of a pass for that one. And that's the only time we've ever seen him get hurt. So the durability is certainly in his favor. Yuri, not a huge leg kicker. He lands some. Both guys do. I just think the knee and the ankle and all that being better for Hill is going to be the deciding factor, because he does move so much better. He is so much sharper, more volume. With that, I mean, the total's weird because, someone's going to get finished, right? Yuri can finish anyone shortly before he himself gets knocked out, and that's always in play. I'm not betting it myself. I just don't love the numbers, but yeah. If I was taking it now and I didn't do the luck ratings thing, I would probably go with Hill inside the distance, because I think the overwhelming likelihood is that one of them ends up knocked out at one point or the other. And I think Hill has the stylistic advantage, so put those together. That's kind of how we get there.
Kevin Holland versus Reinier de Ridder also on the main card. I believe this is the first fight on the main card. Very binary matchup. Holland, the much better striker. De Ridder, the bigger man, and also the better wrestler in this fight. But Holland can grapple, really get submission skills, even when he's on his back. In a scramble, could slap on a Darce. I think this is, I'm not sure if I said it, but this is extremely binary, just because I think either de Ridder gets on top, uses his size, physicality to hold Holland down, maybe get a submission, land some ground and pound, or he's not able to get the takedowns, or Holland scrambles up from the takedowns and is able to put his striking on display and knock de Ridder out. De Ridder really didn't impress me in his UFC debut against Gerald Meerschaert. This is a guy who came over with a lot of hype. I believe he was a 2-division champion in one championship, or he fought for 2 belts. He ended up losing.
He fought for 3.
He fought for a third, so he wasn't
had
a
2
champion.
He lost when he tried to go up to heavyweight. But
got it, thank you. And it's worth noting he competed at heavyweight, and Holland is a guy who fought at welterweight, did his best work maybe at welterweight, has come back up to 185. So there is a size discrepancy between these two. I would expect de Ridder to land a takedown in the first round, and we'll see from there whether Holland is able to get up, whether he's able to scramble at all underneath de Ridder's size. So I like the under. The ends inside the distance. That said, I think more of the finishing equity is tied to Holland. I think de Ridder would be happy to just not lay and pray, but control the clinch, control positioning as much as he can in this fight and slow it down. So under 2.5 rounds at -145 interests me, but I might actually prefer Holland inside the distance to finish de Ridder. Maybe even Holland rounds 2 and rounds 3, in addition to a live bet after round 1 could be a good angle as well. Billy, any thoughts on Holland and Reinier de Ridder?
I'm going to get back to that one on my best bets. I'll save that one. So
cool.
I'm transitioning to my other props right now. I like Bernardo Sopaj inside the distance at 2-1. I actually wrote this up when this fight was first booked. That was my bet there. I think it was one of my best bets. Whatever. Sopaj fights like a bat out of hell. He's been a pro since he was 15. Great wrestler. He's taken on Ricky Tercios, who accepts takedowns and tries to get submissions off his back, but often gets beat up while he's down there. And then Sopaj just a much more dynamic, explosive striker. He got pretty badly knocked out in his debut, but I think he was winning until late in the fight. And that was a fight he took on 4 days notice and had to fly across the world. So you project all of that forward. I really like Sopaj by finish. You could also go Sopaj. His point spread at -3.5 gets him to even money. I like that too. I just don't think Ricky Tercios is that great. He's a good guy to have around to make some of these more exciting fighters look good. And then the other one I'm on is Rinya Nakamura to pick up a finish at +180. He's Japan's Bo Nickel. He's only been doing MMA since about 2020 when COVID canceled the Olympics. He didn't finish his last 2 fights in the UFC, but he's got big power. He starts some people on the road to UFC tournament. And then obviously I expect the grappling to just level up considerably as he gets deeper into his career. Way better athlete than Ewan Gafarov. Way better grappler. Probably the worst technical striker, but Gafarov was taken down 3 times by Kyung Ho Kang, and now he's fighting, like, at one point, who was the best wrestler in this weight class in the world. Like, he won the under-23 world championship. So with this wide of a money line, I think he should finish it more often than the +180 odds indicate. And again, I sound like a broken record here, but his point spread is -135. This one is -5.5 despite being a 3-round fight, which makes it kind of tricky. Probably wouldn't take that one as much.
Worth noting on the Sopaj fight, this fight was rescheduled for November. Sopaj was a -375 favorite when that fight was taken off the board. It was Tercios who pulled out of the matchup after an issue. He got sick weight cutting. I think Sopaj is a tremendous fighter. His loss to Vinicius Oliveira has aged extremely well. Oliveira came out and dominated Ricky Simón in his next fight after. Didn't get taken down by Simón. Sopaj was taking him down in the first couple rounds. I think Vinicius Oliveira is a serious prospect in the flyweight division. I think Sopaj, right there with him, was winning that fight until the brutal knockout of the year candidate in round 3 with the flying knee. But yeah, I'm very high on Sopaj, and I think -250 on the money line is a steal for a guy he's probably going to control and hit much harder against over the course of 15 minutes. I think Tercios is a good fighter. I think he has a high floor in every fight due to his volume, but in certain matchups, he's at a clear wrestling disadvantage. And I think this is one of those where Sopaj should be able to land takedowns at will. Nakamura, to his credit as well, should also be able to land takedowns at will against Moon Gafarov. Kind of feeling more of a later finish for Nakamura, like cardio-oriented wrestling finish from Nakamura, maybe rounds 2 and rounds 3. Let's take a look at those odds real quick. I think I saw Sopaj was like +550 round 1 and then 10-1 round 2. Nakamura is 5-1 in round 1, +650 round 2, 10-1 in round 3. Could see maybe a little round 2, round 3 sprinkle on Nakamura there. How do you feel about like the pace of that finish in the Nakamura fight, Billy?
Yeah, I think that's sharp. If you think he just wears him down with wrestling and keeps putting him on his back, I don't think of Gafarov as being like a cardio liability necessarily, but he's also not a guy that he's not Merab or whatever, where we think he's going to push that pace later on. His finish in the UFC was early. He got submitted in the first round by said Nurmagomedov. As a reminder for everyone, that is an unrelated Nurmagomedov, who is not nearly the grappler of Khabib and Umar and Usman and all those guys. So if Said can do it, it wouldn't shock me if Nakamura gets a quick one, but I do think the late rounds are probably a little bit undervalued, relatively speaking.
Yeah, Saeed just has that ninja choke he slaps on everybody in the first 15 seconds of the fight. He seems to get people out of there. Doesn't have the depth of the grappling game or the wrestling game as the other Nurmagomedov's namesakes, even though he's unrelated. But he does have one very nasty technique, which seems to work very quickly against a lot of opponents. We already touched on all the main card fights, which I'm happy to see. But we're going to pivot to our best bets here. And Billy will be going back to the main card for a couple of his best bets, which he's already mentioned. I do want to give out one more underdog here, though. Zachary Reese at +170. Billy, not sure if you're in agreement on this one. He was a big favorite against Cedric Dumas. I believe he was -230 against Dumas when that fight was canceled. Now he's getting Azamat Bakoyev on short notice. This guy was the LFA champion, but he's much smaller. Zachary Reese, 5-inch reach advantage. He's 4 inches taller. He was the one on a full training camp where Bakoyev is coming in on short notice. And Bakoyev's LFA career wasn't uber impressive to me. We've seen Dennis Bubka in the UFC. They had a close and competitive split decision where Bubka was landing the better strikes. I think Bakoyev has wrestling upside here. I think Reese very likely to get taken down in the first round, but he is a very nasty submission game from guard. I think he can win this fight off of his back, and he just proved in his last fight that he can go all 15 minutes. Prior to that last fight, I had Reese filed under that round one finisher archetype where you fade them after round one. Billy would agree with that. And I think I even live bet against Reese in his last fight. And then he proved to me that he could go 15 minutes and actually continue wrestling in round three and displayed a pretty good skill set. So absent that performance, I'd be very skeptical about betting Reese here. I think he absolutely can finish this fight at any point. And I think the short notice nature for Makhachev probably neutralizes what would normally be a cardio advantage. So give me Reese at plus 170. I also like the under probably when this prop's open for this fight. It hasn't really come out yet. But Reese inside the distance, Reese plus 170. And then likely, if I can get it, an under 2.5 at a reasonable price. Billy, thoughts on Zachary Reese for this weekend?
Yeah, I was surprised these lines came out this way. Usually you get a short notice fighter, they're almost by default installed as an underdog. And I was excited to bet Makhachev as an underdog because I do think he's a high-level prospect and we'll get there. But this heavy of a favorite on short notice doesn't make a ton of sense to me. I'm a little bit, I think, lower overall on Zach Reese than you just because his grappling's kind of weird, for lack of a better term. Like, he's not the traditional going to dominate you from the top, stay safe, beat you up, then find a submission kind of thing that we see from the Dagestani guys, among others. So I'm probably not betting it myself, but with this price, like, the side is clear. Like, if you're going to bet a side, it absolutely has to be Zach Reese. And then my best bet, I'm a little bit more confident in this one, the binary fight you referred to earlier. Reinier de Ridder fighting the Dutch Knight fighting Kevin Holland, which I'm 99% sure the UFC did on purpose just because they like to do stuff like that with the names. There's just a couple things working against Holland here. He lost his last fight to a grappler in Roman Dolidze, but it was stopped due to a rib injury. Not a huge injury, but that was just 3 months ago. So Holland was almost certainly out of the gym, at least for a couple weeks in there. Holland is a guy who has publicly campaigned to only be matched up with strikers. He's like, don't give me grapplers. I hate it. I want to put on fun fights. And now they just throw another one at him. And then de Ridder, not only can he wrestle, but he's got a judo base. So if these guys get close, he can find takedowns without expending a ton of energy. But he can also shoot from the outside and force some clinches. The one thing that worries me a little bit about de Ridder is his chin. Holland coming up from welterweight, where I was more scared of his power, mitigates that a little bit. But the only person to ever finish or beat de Ridder is Anatoly Malkin, who he challenged for the heavyweight title and then lost the light heavyweight title to. Big-ish dude, but clearly not a heavyweight, clearly not a light heavyweight. I think some of that is less concerning here. You said you weren't impressed by him in his debut, which I, to a degree, agree with. One thing that was really impressive about his debut is that he made Gerald Meerschaert want to defend takedowns and strike. Gerald Meerschaert, I think, has more submissions than anyone in middleweight history. Not a good striker. Wanted to strike with de Ridder. De Ridder, not a good striker either. He looks awkward, but he's got some pop. He dropped Meerschaert at the end of the first round. Would have been a knockout had it came like 10 seconds earlier. So he'll lose the striking, but he's dangerous enough that he could find a big moment in there. And I just think it's a huge grappling advantage. Like, kid started judo at age 6, competed at a high level across the world. So you're still getting, I think, minus 110 is the best on de Ridder. It's been bouncing around a little bit. Anything inside of minus 120 or so, I'm taking him straight up because it wouldn't shock me to see him just top control his way to a victory and not find the submission against Holland. But also he could find a submission if Holland gets tired or frustrated or starts doing dumb stuff or talks or, Kevin Holland things.
I would actually jump on it now if you like the de Ridder side. It has started to move his way. He opened plus 125 for this fight. Best available price right now, minus 115. It's on the move this morning. DraftKings actually all the way up to minus 130. FanDuel is as well. So Holland getting out to plus 110. I may actually be interested in Holland at plus money. I'll continue to monitor that line and see where it goes. But yeah, if you like de Ridder, I would jump on it now at the minus 115s. And to that point, you got Jamal Hill in your luck ratings piece earlier this week at minus 112. We discussed the fact that it's moved up closer to minus 140, minus 145. There is a minus 125 currently at DraftKings. I would consider jumping on that. What's your cutoff price for Jamal Hill?
Before you said that, I was actually going to say minus 125. So I think at this point, you just take the inside the distance, right? Like, unless you're getting it closer to minus 110 or so. I wouldn't hate it if someone said I still had to bet a money line and I could get minus 125 on Hill. I probably would. I'm just not seeing enough value that it would keep me from getting the inside the distance. It not huge, but mostly significant plus money.
And that'll do it for our UFC betting preview for UFC 311. You can find more UFC betting content from Billy Ward and myself, both in the Action Network app and on actionnetwork.com. Don't forget to download the free award-winning Action Network app and sign up for an Action Pro for immediate access to extra picks and analysis. Best of luck with all of your bets this weekend. Enjoy the violets. Thank you for listening. We'll see you back here in a couple weeks.